I am Lauren, 32 years old, and nothing prepared me for the day I buried my husband Ethan. I thought the hardest part would be saying goodbye, but it was standing there alone, staring at rows of empty chairs that should have been filled by my parents, my sister Rachel, and even Jessica, the friend who once swore she would never leave my side. While I clutched roses at his grave, they were somewhere else lifting glasses, toasting love, and laughing like my pain was invisible. What would you do if the very people you trusted most chose celebration over your grief? Stay with me, because I promise the truth of what happened next will leave you breathless. Let me take you back to where it began. They lowered Ethan's casket into the ground, and the dull thud of dirt hitting wood echoed through the gray morning air. I stood there in my black dress, the hem damp from the drizzle that refused to let up, surrounded by strangers whose faces blurred together with pity I could not bear to meet. My hands trembled as I clutched the small bouquet of white roses, the only flowers I had chosen myself. Every step of this day felt wrong, like a play missing half the cast. My family's row of chairs sat empty, a cruel reminder that not one of them had come. I shifted my eyes to Ethan's parents standing close by. His mother, Sharon, leaned heavily against her husband, David, both of them red-eyed but steady. They had been my anchors through these past months, their grief deep but their presence unwavering. It was their strength that held me upright now. What I did not have was the sight of my own mother, Margaret, or my father, Thomas, no Rachel, with her sharp tongue hidden behind a glass of champagne. Not even Jessica, the woman who had been my best friend since we were children. Their absence was louder than the minister's words, heavier than the damp soil filling Ethan's grave. A gust of wind brushed my face, carrying the scent of wet earth. My phone vibrated in my clutch. Against my better judgment, I glanced down. A message glared on the screen from my mother. "We need to talk now." I froze, breath caught in my throat. Beneath it, the screen flooded with notifications, call after call stacked on top of each other. 66 missed calls, all in the last hour. My stomach turned. They had found their voices too late, just as Ethan's body disappeared beneath the soil. The minister's voice droned on, speaking of peace and eternal rest. My ears buzzed. My gaze fixed on the coffin as the ropes slowly pulled it down. My legs ached to move, to scream, to do something, but all I could do was stand and hold myself still. I whispered inside Ethan, "I'm here. I'm sorry, it's only me." My throat burned as if the words were clawing to escape. Sharon touched my elbow gently. Her hand was cool, grounding. "You're not alone," she murmured. I nodded, swallowing hard, but the truth was I had never felt lonelier. The drizzle thickened, wetting my hair, clinging to the veil of black lace that framed my face. Strangers shuffled past to lay flowers at the grave, offering nods and soft words, most of them Ethan's coworkers and college friends. They meant well, and their kindness mattered, but all I could think about was the empty space where my own blood should have been. I remembered the night before when I had sat at my kitchen table with Ethan's suit laid out in front of me. I had chosen the navy one he wore at our wedding, pressed it carefully, smoothed the lapels as if he would walk into the room and put it on himself. Instead, I had handed it to the funeral director, watching it disappear into a back room, knowing it would be the last thing he ever wore. I had cried until my head ached alone in that apartment filled with his scent and silence. I had begged silently for someone to call for my mother, to check in for my sister, to care for Jessica, to show up. The phone had stayed silent until this morning, when it screamed with missed calls that no longer mattered. The minister closed his book. The crowd shifted. Someone behind me sniffled. Sharon clutched David's arm tighter, her small frame shaking. I reached for her hand and she squeezed mine, the three of us linked in grief. A shovel scraped against stone. More dirt tumbled into the grave, each clump heavy final. I imagined Ethan's voice in my ear, soft and teasing the way he used to sound when I was upset. "Breathe, Lauren. Just breathe." My chest rose and fell shallow and ragged. My phone vibrated again. I ignored it, pressing it tighter into my palm. Whatever they wanted to say now could not erase what they had done. The drizzle turned to rain and someone opened an umbrella over me. a kind gesture from one of Ethan's coworkers. I shook my head and let the rain soak me. It felt right. It felt honest. When the service ended, people came to me one by one. A young man from Ethan's team at the renewable energy firm shared a story about a late-night project Ethan had stayed to finish with him, how he had bought the team donuts the next morning just to keep morale up. A neighbor from our apartment building recalled how Ethan used to carry her groceries when her back was acting up. Each memory carved deeper into me, a reminder of the man we had lost, of the life I had built with him, and of the family who had chosen not to honor him. As the crowd thinned, Sharon whispered, "We'll take care of the flowers. Go home and rest, sweetheart." I nodded, numb, but my eyes lingered on the grave. My hand brushed the damp petals of the roses I had laid. My lips formed the words I had spoken to Ethan every night. "I love you more than yesterday, less than tomorrow." My voice cracked, but I finished. The rain ran down my face, hiding the tears. I turned, then, clutching my useless phone, the 66 missed calls a silent chorus in my hand, and walked slowly toward the waiting car. The car door shut with a dull thud, and the world outside blurred through the rain-streaked window. My reflection stared back at me, pale and hollow, and for a moment I almost did not recognize the woman looking back. My thoughts spun, pulling me backward, far away from the cemetery and into the memory of where it all began. It was the spring of 2014, my sophomore year at Northwestern University. Finals were looming and the library was packed with students fighting for space. I carried a tower of psychology textbooks to a corner table when someone rushed past and clipped my elbow. The books slipped from my arms, pages splaying across the floor. I remember gasping in frustration and kneeling down to gather them when a tall young man dropped to his knees beside me. His hands were calloused, his smile crooked but kind. "Let me help," he said, stacking the books neatly before offering me the top one. I felt my cheeks flush, both from embarrassment and something I could not name yet. He apologized again and insisted he owed me a coffee. I laughed, shaking my head, but somehow we ended up at the small cafe across from campus, the smell of burnt espresso and muffins filling the air. That was Ethan Parker. We sat at a tiny table and I noticed the way he leaned in when I spoke, as if every word mattered. He told me he was studying engineering, working part-time at a hardware store to cover his expenses. His father was a mechanic back in Indiana, his mother a nurse who had just retired early due to health issues. There was no pretense in his voice, no attempt to impress me with connections or wealth. He simply was who he was. By the time we left the cafe, my chest ached with a strange lightness. He walked me back to the library and held the door open, and as he smiled, I felt something shift inside me, though I did not admit it then. Our lives began to intertwine quickly after that. Study sessions turned into late-night walks along Lake Michigan, bundled up in hoodies against the Chicago wind. He would bring me snacks from his part-time job, laughing as he handed me a pack of peanut butter crackers like it was fine dining. I would help him edit his papers, teasing him for his messy handwriting and the grease stains smudged across his notes. It did not take long for me to realize how different his world was from mine. I grew up in a quiet suburb outside of Chicago, in a house with a neatly trimmed lawn, 2 cars in the driveway, and parents who cared deeply about appearances. Ethan's stories were full of scraped knuckles in his father's garage, and nights his mother worked double shifts at the hospital. Where my parents measured worth in country club memberships and alumni donations, Ethan measured it in hard work and loyalty. The first time I mentioned him to my mother, Margaret, her lips pressed into a thin line. She asked what his parents did, and when I told her, she sniffed as if she had caught a bad odor. "You can do better, Lauren. Think about your future. He will never be able to give you the life you deserve." My father, Thomas, was more blunt. "That boy has nothing to offer. No connections, no family money, nothing but student loans. Why waste your time?" I remember sitting at the dinner table, pushing peas around my plate, my heart hammering. I wanted to shout that Ethan had everything that mattered, that he was kind and brilliant, and made me feel like I finally belonged somewhere. Instead, I stayed quiet, only meeting Rachel's smirk across the table. She was 2 years younger, but already held like royalty in our house. Her grades praised her beauty compared to actresses on magazine covers. She leaned back in her chair and said in a sing-song voice that Ethan sounded like a charity case. That night, I cried into my pillow, torn between loyalty to my family and the growing certainty that Ethan was my future. But Ethan had a way of quieting my doubts. He took me to meet his parents in their modest home in Indiana, a place that smelled of motor oil and fresh-baked bread. Sharon hugged me tight, her eyes shining, while David shook my hand with a grip strong and sure. They treated me as though I was already family. At dinner, we passed dishes around the table, laughter filling the room. It was simple, warm, and genuine, everything I had always wanted, but never quite felt in my own home. Ethan noticed the tension in me when I returned from visits with my parents. He never pressured me to choose, never spoke ill of them, but once he caught my hand and said softly, "They don't see you the way I do. You're stronger than you think. You deserve to be loved without conditions." That sentence lived in my chest long after. By junior year, Ethan and I were inseparable. He studied late into the night, often falling asleep at his desk. I would drape a blanket over him, kiss his hair, and whisper good luck before my own exams. We dreamed aloud about the future, small things like owning a dog or traveling to Colorado to hike the Rockies. He wanted to design renewable energy systems that would change how communities lived. I wanted to work in marketing to tell stories that mattered, though deep down, I simply wanted a life built beside him. The more serious we became, the more my parents disapproved. Margaret scolded me one Sunday morning, saying I was wasting my prime years on someone who would never climb the social ladder. Thomas warned me that marrying Ethan would mean a life of mediocrity. Rachel's comments were sharper. She would laugh about how I was playing house with a poor mechanic's son. She was already interning at a law firm in New York by then, praised for her ambition, courted by wealthy young men at networking events. Every success of hers was paraded in front of me, every small joy of mine minimized. Jessica, my best friend since childhood, tried at first to defend me. She whispered after one family dinner that my parents were tough but loved me in their way. But I noticed even then how her closeness with Rachel grew, how she began spending more time at Rachel's apartment than mine. Despite all that, I held fast to Ethan. The deeper my family tried to pry us apart, the stronger I clung to him. He was my safe place, the one who never made me feel small or unworthy. The memory of those years now felt like another lifetime, a world far removed from the rain-soaked cemetery I had just left. I leaned back in the car seat, the sound of raindrops tapping against the glass, and let the warmth of those first days wash over me. Ethan's laugh, the smell of his old hoodie, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about engines and turbines. I closed my eyes and whispered almost to myself, if only they had seen him like I did. The car slowed as we turned onto the familiar street toward my apartment, and the ache in my chest returned sharp and unrelenting. I still remember the spring of 2016 when Ethan slipped a small ring onto my finger while we were sitting on a bench near Lake Michigan. There was nothing elaborate about it. No crowd, no staged photos, just the sound of waves against the rocks and his nervous laugh as he asked me if I would marry him. My yes came through tears and laughter all at once, and we hugged each other so tightly I could hardly breathe. We decided to plan a wedding that matched who we were. We didn't want a ballroom or a guest list of hundreds. We wanted something small, something we could pay for ourselves without owing anyone favors. After months of saving every extra dollar, tucked away from my marketing job and his engineering work, we rented a modest hall on the west side of Chicago. The decorations were simple white fairy lights strung along the beams, a buffet dinner prepared by a local catering company we trusted. Ethan wore a navy suit that fit him perfectly, and when I walked down the aisle in my lace gown, his eyes filled with tears. For that moment, I forgot all the tension outside those walls. All I saw was him. But my family sat stiff in the front row, their expressions frozen like portraits. My mother's lips pinched as if she had tasted something sour. My father stared straight ahead, clapping politely at the right moments, but never meeting my gaze. Rachel leaned back in her chair, her phone in her hand, thumbs flying across the screen. I caught her smirk when she glanced up, whispering something to Jessica beside her. Jessica had been my maid of honor. I had chosen her without hesitation, remembering sleepovers, as girls' late-night talks through high school, her promise we would always be there for each other. She helped me zip my dress that morning and told me I looked beautiful. But when the reception began, she drifted toward Rachel's table, laughing at her jokes, sipping wine with her instead of standing beside me. I watched her from across the room as she leaned in close the way she used to lean in with me. The sting was sharp, but I tried to push it aside. Ethan squeezed my hand under the table, whispering that this was our night, not theirs. He was right. When we danced to the song we had chosen, the rest of the room faded. His arms around me, his smile, his whispered, "I love you," that was all that mattered. Still, the absence of warmth from my own family was impossible to ignore. My parents avoided conversation with Ethan's parents, who sat graciously trying to fill the silence with kind words. Sharon complimented my dress. David raised a toast to us with genuine pride. In contrast, my parents left early, murmuring something about traffic and an early morning meeting. Rachel disappeared before the cake was even cut. I stood near the doorway as she slipped out, phone in hand, not even offering a goodbye. Jessica trailed behind her a few minutes later, giving me a quick hug that felt rehearsed. "You'll be fine," she said, then hurried after Rachel. After the guests were gone and the hall was quiet, Ethan and I sat together on the stage, our shoes kicked off our plates filled with leftover cake. We laughed about the tiny mishaps, like the flower girl refusing to walk down the aisle and the microphone cutting out during the vows. He brushed a crumb from my lip and said softly, "We did it, Lauren. We built this ourselves." In that moment, I felt stronger than I ever had before. My parents' coldness could not erase the truth. We were married, and it was beautiful because it was ours. The following weeks only reinforced the divide. Family dinners became strained. Rachel bragged about her internship at a New York law firm, her plans to move there permanently. My parents hung on her every word, eyes shining with pride. When they turned to me, they asked when Ethan and I would buy a bigger place, when he would move up into management, when I would quit working so much and focus on raising children. The double standard burned. Rachel was encouraged to chase her career and wait for the right man, while I was reminded daily that my choice of husband was a disappointment. At one dinner, Rachel quipped that our wedding looked more like a graduation party than a celebration. My mother chuckled under her breath, and my father shook his head as if to say she wasn't entirely wrong. Ethan sat beside me, his hand steady on my knee, silently reminding me that their approval did not define us. Later that night, he held me close in our small apartment, whispering that our love was real, stronger than their judgments. I tried to believe it completely, but the ache of their disapproval lingered. I wanted my mother to smile at me the way she smiled at Rachel. I wanted my father to boast about Ethan's achievements the way he boasted about Rachel's. Instead, I received silence, subtle digs, and comparisons I could never win. One afternoon, Jessica stopped by our apartment. She perched on the edge of the couch, scrolling her phone. She mentioned casually that Rachel had been invited to a gala in New York and was meeting important people. She asked why Ethan and I didn't just accept financial help from my parents to upgrade our lives. I told her firmly we didn't want their money, that every dollar came with strings. She laughed lightly, saying maybe I was being too proud. I watched her eyes light up as Rachel's name popped on her phone screen, and I realized even Jessica had started to see my sister as the brighter star. Despite it all, those first months of marriage were filled with joy. Ethan and I cooked dinners together in our tiny kitchen, burning more meals than we perfected. We spent weekends exploring the city, walking hand in hand through neighborhoods we couldn't afford to live in, dreaming about one day. He talked about designing better wind turbines, about leaving a mark on the world. I dreamed about writing campaigns that mattered, telling stories that could change minds. Our apartment was small, but it was full of love. We painted the walls a soft blue, bought second-hand furniture, and laughed about how nothing matched. On Sundays, we curled up with coffee and planned imaginary vacations. We were broke, but happy, united against the disapproval that shadowed us. I held on to that happiness, even as my parents' voices echoed in my ears, telling me I had settled for less. Sitting now in the quiet of the car after Ethan's funeral, those memories played like old home movies in my mind. The warmth of his hand, the laughter of our wedding night, the vows we had whispered under twinkling lights. The driver pulled up to the curb in front of my apartment, and the familiar brick building loomed ahead. My chest tightened again, not from grief this time, but from the weight of knowing that behind those walls lay every memory we had built together, and that I would be walking in alone. The hallway smelled faintly of old carpet and takeout as I climbed the stairs to our apartment. My key felt heavier than usual in my hand, and when the lock clicked open, silence poured out of the doorway to meet me. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me, and the quiet pressed in from every corner. The living room looked just as we had left it, the throw blanket still folded neatly on the couch, the framed photos on the wall catching the dim light. I dropped my bag on the counter and stood for a long moment staring at the coffee mugs drying by the sink. One had a chip on the handle, Ethan's favorite, and my chest clenched as if the air itself was too sharp. I sank into the couch, running my fingers along the worn fabric, and memories washed over me. I thought of the evenings we spent here watching old sitcoms with bowls of popcorn balanced on our laps. He would laugh so loudly at the punchlines that the neighbors once knocked on the wall. On Sundays we would sit here with our laptops planning imaginary vacations to Colorado or Italy, talking about houses we would never afford but loved to dream about. I rose and walked into the small kitchen. The fridge still had his sticky notes, reminders about groceries, or little jokes he left for me. One read, "Buy more peanut butter crackers," the snack he had practically lived on during college. My throat tightened. I traced the note with my fingertip and felt tears rise before I could stop them. Our bedroom was the hardest to face. The bed was neatly made the way I had forced myself to do that morning before the funeral. His dresser still smelled faintly of his cologne, and his shoes were lined up by the closet. I picked up the flannel shirt he had worn almost every weekend, and buried my face in it, breathing in the faint trace of him that lingered in the fabric. My knees gave out, and I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching it to my chest. When we first moved into this apartment, it had felt impossibly small, but we made it ours. The walls were painted a pale blue we picked together, the color of a summer sky. The furniture didn't match, most of it secondhand, but Ethan had a way of turning flaws into quirks. He would say it gave the place character. We filled it with laughter and arguments, and plans for the future, the kind of ordinary life we both wanted so badly. I remembered one evening when the air conditioning broke in the middle of July. We opened every window and lay on the floor with glasses of iced tea, laughing at how ridiculous we looked. Ethan told me then that the size of a place didn't matter, that what made a home was who shared it. I believed him, but my family never stopped reminding me that our apartment was too small, too modest, too far beneath what they thought I deserved. At holiday dinners, my mother would ask pointedly when we would move somewhere bigger. My father would comment about how Rachel had just signed a lease on a sleek loft in Manhattan, paid for with her impressive salary at a law firm. Then their eyes would turn to me, the silence filled with judgment. Rachel loved to emphasize the difference. She once visited for a brief 10 minutes, standing in the doorway with her coat still on her eyes, scanning the space like she was appraising it for sale. Cute, she said, though her tone carried more pity than praise. She told me I should convince Ethan to aim higher, that there were men out there who could provide me with a real life. She laughed as she said it, but the words stuck like splinters. Even Jessica, who had once curled up on this very couch with me during college movie marathons, began to drift. She commented one night that the apartment was cozy, which I knew was her polite way of saying small. She spent more and more time with Rachel, dazzled by the shiny parties and influential people Rachel surrounded herself with. I brushed my hand across the quilt on the bed, the one Ethan's mother had made for us as a wedding gift. Every stitch was careful, made with love. It stood in stark contrast to the cold gifts my parents had offered. Rachel had received designer jewelry for her last birthday, while I had been handed a set of cookware with the receipt still tucked in the bag. The message had been clear. Ethan used to hold my hand under the table at family dinners, giving me a squeeze whenever the comparisons grew too sharp. He never spoke up in anger, never argued, just let his quiet support anchor me. Afterward, when we walked home, he would remind me that what we had was worth more than anything they measured. In those early years of marriage, we made the best of what we had. We couldn't afford lavish trips, so we explored our own city. We biked along the lakefront, discovered hidden diners, and spent entire Saturdays at thrift stores hunting for treasures. We laughed about our mismatched plates, about how the neighbor upstairs walked like he was wearing bricks. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. I sat on the edge of the bed, now staring at the framed photo on the nightstand. It was from our second anniversary, the two of us bundled in winter coats, cheeks red from the cold, grinning into the camera as snowflakes fell around us. My hand trembled as I traced his smile through the glass. The apartment felt heavier with every breath, as though the walls themselves remembered all the love and laughter and were grieving too. I lay back on the bed, clutching his flannel shirt, and listened to the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the next room. It was the only sound in the silence that had taken over. I closed my eyes and tried to hold on to the memory of his laugh, the warmth of his hand, the steady certainty he always carried. The world outside could measure us by money or status, but here in this small space, we had built something bigger than any of that. Sleep tugged at me, but my eyes burned with tears that refused to fall. I whispered into the empty room, "You were right, Ethan. This was our home." My voice broke on the last word. The darkness thickened around me, and I let the silence take me for a while. The first time Ethan complained about the pounding in his head, I brushed it off as stress. He was juggling long hours at Midwest Renewable Systems, staying late to finish projects, coming home with grease smudges on his hands and dark circles under his eyes. I made him tea, rubbed his shoulders, told him he needed rest. He smiled at me, like always grateful but stubborn, insisting he was fine. Weeks passed and the headaches grew worse. He started waking in the middle of the night, clutching his temples, sweat soaking the sheets. I would hold a cold cloth to his forehead and whisper reassurances until the pain dulled enough for him to sleep again. When he began forgetting small things like where he had put his keys or what day it was, fear took root in my stomach. One morning in the fall of 2021, he laced up his running shoes and kissed my cheek before heading out. An hour later, my phone rang. It was a stranger's voice telling me Ethan had collapsed on the path by the lake. I ran out the door without even locking it, my chest burning as I sprinted to the emergency room. When I saw him lying pale and still under fluorescent lights, wires attached to his chest, my knees nearly buckled. The diagnosis came quickly, a blur of medical terms and grim faces. Glioblastoma, stage 4 brain cancer, 6 months to a year with treatment. Without it less. My breath caught as if the words themselves had stolen air from the room. Ethan reached for my hand, his grip still strong, his eyes steady. "We'll fight it," he whispered, as if determination alone could bend fate. I called my parents that night, my voice shaking. "Mom, Dad, Ethan has cancer. It's serious." I needed them to care, to say they would come, to remind me I wasn't carrying this alone. My mother's voice held only polite concern. "That's terrible," she said, though her tone sounded distracted. "Are you sure it's not something the doctors exaggerated?" I told her we had seen 3 specialists. She sighed, then changed the subject, her voice brightening as she said Rachel thought her boyfriend might propose soon. I gripped the phone tighter, staring at Ethan lying on the couch, exhausted from the hospital stay. He needed hope, but all I had to give him was a family too wrapped up in themselves to see beyond their own reflection. When I told my father, he muttered something about medical expenses, asked if Ethan's insurance would cover it, then said they were stretched thin with Rachel's possible engagement. "Maybe next month we can help," he offered, as if cancer could wait, politely until his schedule was clear. Rachel sent a short text. "Sorry to hear about Ethan. Hope it doesn't interfere with the holidays." I felt a coldness spread inside me that night, one that would not leave. Jessica came by with a bottle of wine a few days later. She cried when I told her the details, hugging me tightly. She promised she would be there whatever we needed. I believed her then, holding on to her words like a lifeline. In the weeks that followed, those promises began to thin. She had work deadlines, her parents needed her, she wasn't feeling well. Each excuse chipped away at my faith in her. Ethan began treatment, and the battle was brutal. Radiation drained him, leaving him nauseous and frail. Chemotherapy stole his thick hair, left his skin pale and his frame gaunt. I learned how to measure his medications, how to coax him to eat a few spoonfuls of soup, how to clean up quietly when he could not hold anything down. The hospital became our second home. Machines beeped, nurses hurried in and out, and I sat by his side, notebook in hand, writing down every instruction, every possible option. At night, I curled up in the chair beside his bed, listening to the shallow rhythm of his breathing, willing it not to falter. One evening, as I sat with my head against his hand, Ethan stirred. His voice was weak but calm. "People show up differently in crisis," he said. "Some can't handle it. Some disappear. It doesn't mean you're alone." His words cut deep. Even as he fought for his life, he was making excuses for the people who had failed us. His parents moved temporarily to Chicago, renting a small apartment nearby. Sharon cooked meals and brought them to the hospital. David took shifts sitting with Ethan so I could shower or grab a sandwich from the cafeteria. Their devotion humbled me, highlighting the absence of my own parents even more. When Thanksgiving came, I sent a message to my family group chat. "Ethan is weak. The doctors aren't sure how much time he has. Please just come visit," the replies trickled in. My mother wrote that she was sending prayers. My father said they had plans with Rachel and her boyfriend. Rachel herself sent a thumbs-up emoji. Jessica texted that she was helping Rachel plan a dinner party and couldn't get away. I sat in the sterile hospital lounge with tears streaming down my face, my phone cold in my hands. The people who were supposed to love me most had decided Ethan's fight was inconvenient. The holidays passed in a haze of hospital lights and whispered reassurances. Ethan smiled through pain, cracking jokes about the cafeteria food, squeezing my hand when I felt ready to break. He told me he was proud of me, that I was stronger than I knew. I wanted to believe him. But deep down I felt something hardening, a slow burning anger that settled into my bones. If my family could not stand beside us in this moment, then they had made their choice. And I would remember it. One night, after another long day of treatments, Ethan drifted to sleep. I sat in the dim light, staring at the missed calls from Jessica that had come hours too late, the silence from my parents' numbers. My reflection stared back at me from the darkened hospital window, and I realized that the woman looking back was no longer waiting for anyone to show up. She was already alone, except for the man lying in the bed beside her, fighting to hold on to the life they had built together. The hospital became a rhythm I both dreaded and depended on. Mornings began with nurses changing IV bags, the steady beeping of monitors filling the air. I learned to move around the cords and machines as if they were part of our furniture. Ethan tried to smile through it, cracking small jokes when he could, but his strength was slipping. Each week his body grew thinner, his skin paler, yet his grip on my hand still carried the weight of his love. I spent hours at his bedside, spooning broth into his mouth, wiping his forehead when the fever spiked. I kept track of every pill, every dosage, filling pages of a notebook with neat lines of information that made me feel useful. The doctors praised my diligence, but all I wanted was for Ethan to feel human again, not a patient tethered to machines. His parents carried more than their share. Sharon brought warm meals wrapped in foil, her eyes soft but tired. David offered to sit with Ethan so I could shower or step outside for air. They asked for nothing in return, their presence steady and real. Watching them reminded me what family was supposed to mean. The contrast to my own parents cut deeper each day. I sent them updates, short texts begging for a visit. My mother would reply with polite phrases, always adding a note about Rachel's work or her boyfriend's plans. My father sometimes didn't reply at all. Rachel never once showed up. It was as if Ethan's illness had become a nuisance, something they preferred to ignore. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline and the room filled with golden light, I sat beside Ethan reading aloud from a book he had loved in college. His eyelids fluttered, but he smiled at the sound of my voice. Then my phone buzzed. It was my mother. I answered, hoping maybe this time would be different. "Mom, he's so weak. He might not make it much longer. Can you please come?" There was silence on the line before she sighed. "Lauren, You have to be strong. Rachel's boyfriend is planning something big, and we are busy helping her. You know how important this is for her future. I gripped the phone until my knuckles ached. My husband is dying, I said, my voice breaking. Don't be dramatic, she replied sharply. People die every day. Then she added that Rachel was exhausted from her job and needed our support. I hung up before my anger swallowed me whole. Ethan stirred and whispered, "It's okay, don't waste your energy on them." His voice was thin, but his eyes were still full of love. That only made my chest ache more. Jessica's absence stung almost as much. She texted often in the beginning saying she would visit, promising to drop by the hospital. But the excuses piled up. She was busy with a client meeting, or she wasn't feeling well, or she was helping Rachel plan an event. Twice she came sitting uncomfortably in the chair, her eyes darting to the machines, as if she couldn't bear to look at Ethan. She stayed less than an hour each time. After that, she faded into silence too. I told myself I didn't need them, that I had Ethan's parents and my own 2 hands. But in the quiet of the nights when I lay curled in the recliner beside Ethan's bed listening to his uneven breathing, loneliness clawed at me. The people who should have stood beside me had chosen Rachel instead. Bills piled up. My savings drained faster than I thought possible. I had taken family medical leave, so my paycheck had shrunk. Insurance covered some costs, but not all. One night, I swallowed my pride and sent my father a message asking for help with expenses. His reply came hours later. "We are stretched thin right now with Rachel's engagement party. Maybe next month we can see what we can do." Next month, when Ethan might already be gone. I stared at the message until tears blurred the screen, my body shaking with fury and disbelief. Despite the darkness, Ethan still tried to make light of things. He teased the nurses, asked me to sneak him milkshakes, even when the doctor said no. He talked about our dreams as if they were still ahead of us, telling me to remember the dog we wanted, the house with a garden. He refused to let cancer steal his humor. But I saw it every day. The way his shoulders slumped under the hospital gown, the way his steps grew shorter, his breaths more shallow. He was slipping, and I could not stop it. One night, as the machines hummed and the city lights flickered outside the window, I broke. I sat with my head in my hands, sobs racking my body. Sharon came in quietly and wrapped her arms around me. "You are not alone," she whispered. "You are family to us." Her words soothed me in a way my mother's never had. In that moment, I realized that family was not defined by blood, but by love, by showing up when it mattered. And mine had already shown me where I stood. Ethan woke later that night, his voice faint. "Promise me something, Lauren. When I'm gone, don't let them break you. Live your life. Find joy again." His hand trembled in mine, but his eyes were steady. I kissed his knuckles and whispered back, "I promise," though I had no idea how I would keep it. The promise hung in the air, long after he drifted back to sleep. A fragile thread tying me to a future I could not yet imagine. The hospice nurse adjusted the morphine drip, her voice low and careful as she explained what it meant. "His breathing will grow more labored. These next hours or days are about keeping him comfortable." I nodded, unable to trust my voice, my fingers already laced through Ethan's fragile hand. His skin was paper thin now, veins showing like rivers beneath the surface. That night, I barely moved from the recliner beside his bed. The room was dim lit only by the monitor's glow and the faint hum of machines. Every rise and fall of his chest became my entire world. I counted each breath, terrified of when the next one might not come. The promise I had made him echoed in my head, but I could not imagine joy or strength, only the aching possibility of loss. Around midnight, I tried calling my parents again. My voice cracked as I whispered into the phone, "Mom, I think it might be tonight. Please come. I need you." There was a pause before she answered, annoyance dripping in her tone. "Lauren, we have guests from out of town for Rachel's engagement. We cannot just leave." My heart pounded in my ears. "My husband is dying." She sighed as if I were being difficult. "Lower your voice. You're being dramatic. Rachel will only get engaged once." I hung up, shaking the nurse, glancing at me with pity I did not want. Desperate, I dialed Jessica. "Jess, please? I can't do this alone." Her voice was light, cheerful, the sound of a salon in the background. "Oh, Lauren, I'm so sorry. I promised Rachel weeks ago I'd help with her hair for tomorrow. I'll come after the party." My throat closed. I ended the call before I said words I could never take back. At 3:41 in the morning, Ethan's breathing faltered. Sharon and David were on either side of him, their hands resting gently on their son. I held his hand tight, whispering through tears, "I love you, Ethan. Thank you for loving me." His lips curved faintly, and he exhaled one last time, his chest falling still. The silence that followed was deafening, absolute. I stayed there for hours, staring at his face, trying to memorize every detail. The sharp lines of pain that had etched themselves into his features were gone, replaced by the peace I had prayed for. When the funeral home staff finally arrived, my legs buckled as they wheeled him away. Sharon caught me, her arms strong, despite her own shaking. "You don't have to stand tall right now, sweetheart," she whispered. "Let us hold you." By morning, exhaustion wrapped around me like chains. I texted my family in the group chat. Ethan passed away a few hours ago. Funeral arrangements to follow. My father's reply came first. "Sorry for your loss. We will be thinking of you today." My mother followed with a message that made bile rise in my throat. "Such sad news. We will miss you at the party. Let us know about the funeral." Rachel did not respond at all. Jessica sent a private text. "Oh my God, Lauren, I'm so sorry. Do you want me to come?" Seconds later, another message popped up. "Actually, I promised Rachel I'd help decorate the venue this morning. Can I come after the party tonight?" My phone slipped from my hand, clattering onto the tile floor. I left it there, unable to look at the glowing screen any longer. The next 2 days blurred into logistics. Choosing between burial or cremation, selecting a casket for viewing, writing an obituary that felt inadequate for the man he was. Sharon stood beside me, her eyes red, but her posture steady, letting me make the final calls as his wife. David handled phone calls when my voice failed. Together, we pieced together something Ethan would have found simple and dignified. I picked his navy suit, the one from our wedding, smoothing the fabric with trembling hands. He had looked so handsome that day, his eyes shining as he watched me walk down the aisle. Now it would hang loose on his thin frame, but it was right. He deserved to leave this world in something he had loved. At night, I returned to our apartment alone. I sat in the dark, surrounded by silence, tracing his handwriting on old notes, holding his pillow, until I drifted into restless sleep. The world kept spinning, Rachel's party photos already flooding social media, my parents' smiles bright as they toasted her happiness. On the morning of the funeral, I checked my phone one last time, hoping for a message that might tell me they had changed their minds. There was nothing. Only silence from Rachel and a handful of shallow excuses from my parents. Jessica's last text still lingered, unread, her offer to come after the celebration. The gray sky outside mirrored the weight in my chest. I slipped on the black dress I had bought 2 days earlier, pulled my hair into a low bun, and stared at my reflection. My eyes looked older, my face pale and drawn. This was not the woman who had danced barefoot with Ethan in our tiny living room, who had dreamed of children and a garden. This was a widow, 32 years old, already learning to stand without him. As I gathered my things, Sharon called. "We're on our way to the funeral home. We'll meet you there." Her voice, though broken, steadied me enough to move forward. I took one last glance around the apartment, whispered goodbye to the space that still smelled like him, and stepped into the cold drizzle waiting outside. The funeral home smelled faintly of lilies when I arrived, the kind of sweetness that lingers too heavily in the air. Sharon and David were already waiting, both dressed in dark clothes that seemed to swallow them. Sharon took my hand, her grip firm despite the tremor I felt in her fingers. We walked together into the viewing room where Ethan's casket rested, polished wood under the dim light. The navy suit I had chosen was pressed neatly, his tie straightened, his hair combed back the way he always liked. I stood there, frozen, my breath catching as if my body refused to accept what my eyes saw. For a moment it felt like he might sit up, laugh about the fuss, and tell us all to go home. The stillness of his face made that impossible. Guests trickled in as the morning passed. Ethan's coworkers from Midwest Renewable Systems came, their eyes heavy with grief, as they told me stories about projects he had saved nights. He had stayed late to make sure no one failed alone. His college roommate flew in from Seattle, hugging me so tightly I thought my ribs might crack. Neighbors came to, sharing how Ethan had carried groceries for them or fixed a leaky faucet without being asked. Every story painted him exactly as I knew him: kind and steady, a man who gave without expecting anything in return. But the row of seats I had reserved for my own family remained empty. Each time the door opened, I turned, my heart clenching, with a ridiculous hope that maybe they had changed their minds. That hope died a little more with every new face that wasn't theirs. At 10 o'clock, the service began. The celebrant spoke beautifully, describing Ethan's life and the impact he had made in just 34 short years. Sharon and David sat on either side of me, their grief visible but dignified. When it was my turn to speak, my legs shook so badly I wasn't sure I could stand. But I did. I unfolded the paper I had written the night before, though my tears blurred the words. I told them about the boy who had picked up my books in a crowded library, about the man who had dreamed of making renewable energy accessible for small towns, about the husband who had held my hand through every storm. I said that he had taught me what unconditional love looked like, that his legacy was not only in his work, but in the quiet kindness he showed to everyone he met. When I sat down, Sharon pressed a tissue into my hand. David whispered that Ethan would have been proud. The service ended, and we prepared for the burial. As we filed outside into the drizzle, I glanced at my phone out of habit. A notification glared at me from the screen. Rachel had posted photos from her engagement brunch at the Grand Hotel. I should have ignored it, but my thumb opened the album before I could stop myself. There they were, smiling broadly, glasses of champagne raised high. My parents stood close to Rachel, and Jason beaming with pride. Jessica was in the front, clinking her glass with Rachel's, her hair styled perfectly. The timestamp showed the photos had been uploaded only hours before, while I had been standing at Ethan's casket. The world tilted, my knees threatening to give out. Sharon noticed and caught my elbow. "Are you all right?" she whispered. I forced myself to nod, slipping the phone back into my bag. The images burned in my mind sharper than any knife. We drove in a small procession to the cemetery. The rain had softened to a mist, coating everything in a gray sheen. As the casket was lowered, the sound of dirt striking wood made my stomach turn. Sharon and David stepped back to give me space, and I whispered through tears the words I had said to Ethan every night. "I love you more than yesterday, less than tomorrow." My phone vibrated again. Against my will, I looked. A new message from my mother appeared on the screen. "We need to talk now." Beneath it, dozens of missed calls stacked one after another. Calls from my parents, from Rachel, even from Jessica. I turned the phone over in my hand, the screen facing the damp grass, and closed my eyes. The drizzle soaked my hair and dress, but I did not move. The people I had begged for support when Ethan was alive were suddenly desperate to reach me now that he was gone. The cemetery blurred as tears mingled with rain. Around me, Ethan's friends and colleagues lowered their heads, sharing in my grief. They had shown up. They had been here. My own family's absence spoke louder than anything they could ever say. When the last shovel of dirt was pressed into place, I stepped forward, laying a single white rose on the fresh soil. My fingers lingered there, cold and trembling, before I finally let go. The silence of the cemetery pressed around me, broken only by the sound of distant traffic and the soft sobs of Sharon beside me. I looked at the grave one last time before turning toward the waiting car, the phone still buzzing uselessly in my hand. That evening, the apartment felt more hollow than ever. I kicked off my shoes and set my phone face down on the counter, unwilling to see the constant stream of notifications flashing across the screen. I made tea just to have something warm in my hands, then sat on the couch staring at the wall. The quiet was unbearable, so I turned on the lamp and began sorting through the sympathy cards left by Ethan's coworkers. Each one was filled with real words, not the empty phrases I had come to expect from my own family. As I tucked the cards back into a drawer, an email notification popped up on my laptop. The subject line read, "You should see this." It was from Timothy, one of Ethan's colleagues. My heart raced as I clicked it open. A short message appeared above a video file. I was at the Grand Hotel yesterday for a business lunch. I saw your family. I thought you deserved to know what was said. I am so sorry. My hands shook as I pressed play. The screen filled with the image of the hotel's terrace tables decorated with flowers and balloons, the faint sound of a piano in the background. My family sat gathered around a long table, champagne glasses in hand. Bradford, Rachel's fiancé, was standing giving a toast. His voice was clear, praising Rachel for her brilliance and beauty, thanking my parents for organizing the celebration. When he sat down, Rachel stood swaying slightly, as if the champagne had already hit her. I want to thank everyone for coming, she said, grinning. Especially my parents for putting this together despite my sister's constant drama. Laughter rippled around the table. My stomach twisted. Rachel continued, waving her glass. Lauren always has some crisis. First marrying that nobody engineer, then making his illness the center of attention during my engagement. My mother reached over and patted Rachel's arm, smiling indulgently. My father nodded in agreement. Jessica's voice cut in clear as day. Lauren has always been like that. Remember when she thought she deserved valedictorian, or when she made such a big deal about her graduation? The table erupted in laughter again. I slammed the laptop shut, bile rising in my throat. My hands pressed against my mouth as if to hold back the sobs threatening to break free. The people I had begged to stand beside me, the ones who had abandoned me at the worst moment of my life, had not only chosen Rachel's party over Ethan's funeral, they had mocked me, mocked Ethan as if our pain was entertainment. I stood and paced the living room, my breaths coming fast and shallow. The lamplight flickered across the photo frames on the wall. There was Ethan smiling, holding me close at our wedding. There he was on our anniversary trip, his arms slung around my shoulders. These images told the truth of our life. My family's laughter in that video told the truth of theirs. My phone buzzed again on the counter. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. Messages stacked on top of each other. Jessica, please let me explain. I didn't mean it the way it sounded. Another from my mother, we need to meet tomorrow to discuss some family matters. Rachel had finally sent one line. Sorry about Ethan. Hope the funeral went okay. The rage that filled me was cold and steady, unlike the wild grief that had consumed me before. I knew now what I had always tried to deny. Their love for me had conditions. Their loyalty could be bought with champagne toasts and photo ops. They had never seen me as enough. I poured the untouched tea down the sink and opened the laptop again. This time, I forced myself to watch the video twice, memorizing their faces, their laughter, the casual cruelty of their words. Each replay strengthened something inside me. I could not change what they had done to Ethan or to me, but I would never let them pretend they were innocent. Hours later, I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook scribbling everything I remembered, every slight and betrayal that had led to this moment. The forgotten birthdays, the missed milestones, the double standards, the comments about Ethan not being good enough. Years of being second best lined the pages until my hand cramped. When I finally closed the notebook, the drizzle outside had turned to steady rain, tapping against the window like a drumbeat. I felt strangely calm. My family had revealed themselves fully, and I had the proof. They thought they could laugh at me behind champagne glasses and go on as if nothing happened. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, stood, and walked to the bedroom. Ethan's flannel shirt still lay draped across the bed where I had left it. I pressed it to my chest and whispered into the fabric. They don't get to erase us. They don't get to win. The rain fell harder outside as I lay down, the video's cruel laughter still echoing in my ears. I closed my eyes, knowing the morning would bring another storm, this time face to face. The doorbell rang exactly at 11 the next morning. I had been watching the security feed on my phone, already knowing who stood there. My parents were dressed as if they had come from church, stiff suits and pearls, Rachel at their side, in a cream coat, Jessica lingering behind them with her arms folded. Their faces were carefully arranged, too polished for the gravity of the moment. I opened the door just enough to let them in, stepping aside without a word. My mother walked past me, as though she owned the space, my father carrying his leather briefcase. Rachel dropped her purse on the couch and crossed her legs like she was in a waiting room. Jessica avoided my eyes, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her bag. Finally, my mother spoke. "We have been worried, Lauren. You have not returned our calls." Her tone was sharp, like a teacher scolding a child. My father added quickly, "And there are some family matters that need to be addressed." I stayed standing, my arms crossed. "You mean the trust, don't you?" My father blinked, caught off guard. He cleared his throat. "Yes, there have been some changes that require your signature. It is just paperwork, nothing complicated." I laughed, a sound so bitter it startled even me. "Just paperwork? You mean the paperwork that removes me, entirely leaving Rachel with everything?" My mother's lips tightened. "Who told you that those documents are private?" I walked to the table where my laptop sat and opened the folder. Richard, the attorney friend who had reviewed the files, had explained every clause. I turned the screen toward them. "Here at Island, every line you hoped I would sign away while I was still reeling from burying my husband." Rachel rolled her eyes, her voice dripping with disdain. "Can we just get this over with? Sign the papers, Lauren. You do not need the money. You have Ethan's life insurance." The casual cruelty in her tone stole my breath. Even my parents glanced at her in surprise, but neither corrected her. Jessica finally spoke, her voice trembling. "I told them this was not the right time, but they insisted." I looked at her, my fury rising. "The right time? You missed his funeral, Jessica. You sat at a table laughing about me while I stood alone at his grave." She flinched, color draining from her face. My mother tried to regain control. "Lauren, you are being irrational. We are your family. We are here for you." That made me laugh again, louder this time. Family who skipped Ethan's funeral for mimosas and party favors. Family who mocked him while he was dying. I reached for my phone and pressed play. The video Timothy had sent filled the air. Rachel's voice rang out loud and unmistakable, calling Ethan a nobody, making his illness sound like an inconvenience. Jessica's laughter followed, then my parents' approving nods. The sound of champagne glasses clinking echoed through the room. The silence that followed was suffocating. My father rubbed his forehead. "That was taken out of context." "What possible context makes it acceptable to mock a dying man?" I demanded. None of them answered. I pulled out the notebook I had filled days before and tossed it onto the coffee table. Years of keeping score, birthdays, forgotten graduations missed every time Rachel was celebrated while I was ignored. 28 years of patterns written in black and white. Rachel leaned forward, her tone sharp. "You have always been so dramatic. You think the world revolves around you. The truth is, no one cares about your little crises." I stepped closer, my voice steady, despite the rage pulsing through me. "My husband was not a crisis. He was the best man I have ever known. And you, all of you, showed me exactly who you are." Jessica's tears spilled over. "Lauren, please. I made a mistake. I let Rachel pressure me. We have been friends for 20 years. I shook my head. "That friendship ended the day you chose her over me when I needed you most." My father tried one last time, his voice stern. "We are still your family. Blood is thicker than water." I met his eyes, calm now, the storm inside me solidified into resolve. Blood means nothing without love. And you have none for me." I walked to the door and held it open. "Get out." My mother stood, her face pale with anger. "You will regret this. When the grief passes, you will come crawling back." I met her glare. "No, Elizabeth. I will not." One by one they filed out, Rachel muttering under her breath, Jessica sobbing quietly, my father shaking his head. My mother was the last to leave, her perfume lingering in the room long after the door shut behind them. I leaned against the door, my chest heaving, but for the first time in years I felt something close to peace. The video had stripped away the last illusions. Their own words had condemned them. The rain had stopped outside, the silence deep and still. I walked back to the table, closed the laptop, and slid the unsigned documents into a drawer. For once, I was not the one carrying their weight. They were gone and I was free. The days after they left passed in a strange, quiet, heavy but steady, as if the storm had finally moved on. I woke each morning in a bed that felt far too big, but instead of collapsing under the weight, I forced myself into small routines. I made coffee the way Ethan liked it, even if it was only for me. I opened windows to let the light in. I wrote in a journal, sometimes only a single sentence, just to keep the words flowing. One afternoon, I walked into a community center near the hospital where Ethan had spent his final months. A flyer on the bulletin board caught my eye. Widow Support Group, Thursdays at 7. The thought of sitting in a circle of strangers and saying the words out loud made my stomach twist, but something inside me said to go. That Thursday, I found myself in a small room with beige walls and a pot of weak coffee on the table. 8 women sat in a circle, their faces marked by different versions of the same story. Some were older, one had lost her husband decades ago. Others were younger like me, their rings still shining, their grief still raw. When it was my turn, my voice shook as I said my name and told them Ethan had died at 34 from brain cancer. I said my family had abandoned me, that his parents had been the only ones to hold me up. Tears blurred my vision, but when I looked up, every woman in the circle was nodding. They understood without judgment. For the first time in months, I did not feel alone. After the meeting, Sarah, a woman a few years older than me, stopped me at the door. She had lost her husband to a heart attack the year before. She told me the first months were the hardest, that the loneliness came in waves, but so did the strength. She gave me her number and said to call any time, even in the middle of the night. That night, back in my apartment, I read Ethan's old texts, scrolling until the screen blurred. Then I pulled out a letter I had found tucked in his nightstand a week earlier. His handwriting was shaky, but still his. My dearest Lauren, if you're reading this, I am gone. Loving you has been the greatest gift of my life. You are stronger than you think. Please don't waste your strength trying to win over people who never saw your worth. Build a life that makes you smile again. I pressed the letter to my chest, my sobs quiet but cleansing. I took Ethan's advice to heart in the days that followed. I started volunteering at the hospital where he had been treated, sitting with patients during chemo sessions, offering small talk or just quiet company. At first it hurt, each IV drip a reminder of him, but soon it felt like purpose. It felt like honoring him. Ethan's parents came often, bringing food, checking in. One Sunday, Sharon hugged me tightly and said, "You'll always be our daughter. Nothing changes that." Their kindness steadied me more than I could say. Meanwhile, my parents sent voicemails I did not answer. My mother's tone shifted from scolding to pleading. She spoke of moving past disagreements, of Rachel's upcoming wedding, of family obligations. Rachel herself sent a single text weeks later. "You need to stop acting ridiculous and make things right with Mom and Dad." I deleted it without replying. Jessica's messages were more persistent. She wrote long emails about regret, about how she had gotten caught up in Rachel's world, about how she missed our friendship. At first, I read them with clenched teeth, her words bouncing off the wall of hurt she had built herself. Eventually, I stopped opening them at all. At work, my boss welcomed me back with patience. I eased in with part-time hours, and eventually I found my footing. I poured myself into projects, grateful for the distraction, for the sense of progress. Slowly, my confidence returned. Months passed. I sold the apartment Ethan and I had shared. Packing it up nearly broke me, every drawer and corner full of memories. But when I moved into a smaller place near the lake, I felt lighter. I planted flowers on the balcony, the kind he had always liked, and watched them bloom. The first anniversary of his death arrived on a crisp October day. I drove with Sharon and David to Lake Michigan. We stood at the shore, the wind sharp against our faces, and I scattered some of his ashes into the water. The waves carried them away, sunlight glinting off the surface. David put his arm around me and whispered, he would have loved this. That night I sat alone on my balcony, staring up at the stars. I spoke softly into the night air, telling Ethan about the garden, about the group meetings, about Sarah, who had become a friend, about the hospital patients, who reminded me of him. My heart ached, but it no longer felt hollow. It felt full of him in a different way, woven into every step I took forward. When I checked my phone before bed, a new email waited. The subject line read "Family Emergency." My mother's words scrolled across the screen. "Your father has had a heart attack. Rachel's wedding is postponed. We need your help with medical bills. Please call." I stared at the message for a long time, the old reflex of guilt rising in my chest. Then I thought of Ethan's letter, of his words telling me not to waste myself on people who never saw my worth. I closed the email without replying, set the phone on the nightstand, and turned off the light. The darkness that filled the room was not empty this time. It felt like a choice. Spring returned with soft breezes off the lake, and with it came a gentler rhythm to my days. I planted marigolds and lavender in pots on my balcony, watching them catch the morning sunday. The hospital volunteer program grew into something steady, a commitment that grounded me. Patients began to recognize me smiling when I walked in with a book or a thermos of tea. Their gratitude reminded me that my presence mattered. Sarah often joined me for coffee after group meetings. We shared stories not just of grief, but of the small steps forward that made us feel alive again. She told me about her new job teaching art classes, and I told her about the blog I had started writing about loss and resilience. To my surprise, people read it, strangers from across the country who wrote back to say my words made them feel less alone. Ethan's parents remained my anchor. On Sundays we gathered at their house, Sharon cooking too much food as always, David telling the same stories with warmth that made them new each time. They never let me forget that I was still family. When Sharon hugged me goodbye, she whispered, "You'll always have us." And I believed her. My parents tried again. A card arrived in the mail with my mother's neat handwriting. "Family should stick together. Let's put the past behind us." Rachel sent a text weeks later, short and dismissive. "Jason left. Call Mom and Dad. They need you." I placed the card in a drawer with the others and deleted the text. The old guilt no longer clung to me. Their emergencies were no longer mine to solve. Jessica was the only one whose words ever gave me pause. She wrote a letter in her own hand, pages filled with apologies. She admitted she had been weak, too desperate for Rachel's approval, too afraid to stand up for me. She said losing our friendship had been the hardest lesson of her life. I read it twice, then tucked it into a drawer. I was not ready to forgive, but I no longer felt the sharp sting of betrayal when I thought of her. Some wounds closed slowly. As the second anniversary of Ethan's death approached, I planned a quiet day. I took the morning off work, packed a small picnic, and drove to the cemetery with fresh flowers. I sat on the bench beside his headstone, telling him about the garden, the patience, the friendships that had surprised me. I told him I was stronger now, that his faith in me had not been misplaced. Later that afternoon, I walked to the shore of Lake Michigan with a small urn of ashes I had kept. The water sparkled under the sun waves, rolling gently toward the rocks. I opened the urn and let the ashes scatter into the breeze. They swirled for a moment before disappearing into the blue. The air felt lighter, as if he were finally free, and so was I. That evening, I hosted a dinner at my apartment. Sarah came with a casserole, Sharon, and David brought pie, and a couple from the support group brought wine. We ate, laughed, and filled the room with warmth that felt like family. As I looked around the table, I realized I was no longer defined by what I had lost. I was defined by what I had chosen to build. When the dishes were cleared and the candles flickered low, I stepped onto the balcony. The night sky stretched wide, stars scattered across it. I whispered into the breeze, "Thank you, Ethan, for loving me enough to show me what I deserved. I am still carrying you, not as a weight, but as a light." If you are listening to this story, and you have ever been abandoned by the people who should have loved you most, I want you to know that you are not alone. You can choose who you call family. You can set boundaries without guilt. You can survive heartbreak and betrayal and still find joy again. Have you ever had to walk away from family or friends who hurt you? How did you find the strength to put yourself first? Share your story in the comments below. And if this journey spoke to you, stay with me for more stories of resilience, healing, and the kind of revenge that comes from living well.